of the difference between the world price and the foreign gate price in Ghana. Now, it was just announced this past week that Ghana is increasing the price, the farm gate price, for the 25-26 season by 62.58% for the main crop. And normally the main crop season begins October 1. But guess what? That season is starting today. Just happens that the farm gate price that is normally announced would be for October 1, but it's being announced for today. So it's a historic day in terms of Ghana and changing the date for the start of the season. Now, why did that happen? Okay, it's not necessarily that Ghana wants to give the farmers a break and higher prices sooner, okay? But Ghana was behind on their contracts to the multinationals. And if Ghana announced the higher price for later, then the farmers would hold back more of the production, and it would take that much longer to pay forward the multinationals the cocoa that's owed. As one possibility for why they're starting to speed up the season and pay this money sooner. Well, one, to incentivize production going forward and not have 100,000 out of the 600,000 tons they're producing being smuggled across the border to non-producing countries that will pay more for that crop. And so Ghana was losing a lot of foreign exchange because 20%, an estimated 20% this past year of the crop was thought to be smuggled to another country because the farm gate price was too low. The other thing is that the Ghanaian government would always take out a syndicated loan to be able to buy the crop forward from the producers and then sell it. And they were struggling to get the financing. So they were looking internally to get the financing this past year. They had difficulties doing that. And so they're trying as best as possible to manage the situation and turn it around. But this is just one example in terms of Ghana. In the Ivory Coast, it's not that much better. Now, let's look at disease, okay? So we know that there's a strong loss because of disease proliferation. By the way, everybody's gonna be getting the presentation, don't worry about it, okay? You can take photos, but you don't need to. Everyone can have the presentation, okay? English or Spanish version, okay? So here's where I mentioned how Brazil lost such a substantial part of the crop to which is grown. The estimate for the Ivory Coast and Ghana is close to a 20% loss in their production due to disease right now. But some areas, so there's 16 provinces in Ghana, and almost every single one is infected. In some farms, there's 100% infection rate. So I think these estimates are actually fairly low. And that the rate of loss from disease is potentially even higher. Nigeria is lower at about 15%. Since there's no real cure, then it becomes a long-term issue. So I want to step back, and as I said, I cover a whole bunch of different markets. So I want to put this in perspective with not talking about the cocoa market, but I want to tell you a story about the orange juice market. Okay, Florida. Florida was known to be the Sunshine State. On the license plates in the state of Florida, the logo is an orange. there was, everything was related to citrus production in Florida as the largest producing state and used to be larger than Brazil. Then you had a string of freezes that destroyed production in the 1980s. But growers were always resilient and fought back, and they replanted and they continued to expand. But then you wound up having citrus canker disease, no cure, and to stop the spread, farmers had to cut down their trees, and a lot of the nursery stock was destroyed. And that slowed the recovery, and it was very, very expensive and painful for the growers. However, that wasn't the end of the story and the problems. You started to have a string of hurricanes that came through, and in one season, there was 4 hurricanes that crisscrossed Florida, straight through the citrus belt. And that caused the crop to fall on the ground. But it also, the winds from that hurricane, from those 4 hurricanes, spread disease like wildfire. Citrus greening. Florida production peaked 15 years ago at 242 million 90-pound boxes. Can anyone guess what Florida's production is today? Wild guesses. Has anyone been to Disneyland recently and seen any oranges grown in Orange County? No. Any guesses? Close. 12 million boxes. Okay, from 242 million down to 12 million. So growers could not sustain production, and because of urbanization, you have Universal Studios and all the theme parks and housing and everything else, urban sprawl, taking over that land. It didn't go to other agricultural production. And in that time, you had abandoned groves because the growers were so decimated. And then all of a sudden you had another storm. And disease doesn't know boundaries and the wind, and it just carried citrus greening disease from one grove to the next, to the next, to the next. And the growers who struggled and thought they could replant and fight disease could not. Okay, so it does happen in other commodities aside from cocoa. And that is one of the most extreme examples. And that is the fear of what could happen in the Ivory Coast and Ghana. And it's not like out of the realm of possibilities of, no, it can never be. Okay, I mean, disease is, when there's no cure, it's a race against time. And Florida's citrus industry now imports all their juice from Brazil and Mexico, and no one's drinking Florida juice. We're drinking processed oranges, processed juice from other countries in the US. And that's why last week, when President Trump announced a 50% tariff on Brazilian products into the US, and there was an annex with 700 products that were excluded, orange juice was one of them. Okay, next slide. So when we talk about disease, just to go around the globe and give the highlights here, high level, Brazil, as I mentioned, with witch's broom disease. In Malaysia and Indonesia, you have vascular streak dieback and cocoa pod borer. In the Ivory Coast and Ghana, you have black pod and cocoa swollen shoot virus as the main antagonists for hurting production. Next slide. Now let's turn attention to weather and climatic risks. I used some quotes here, and this one was from a Ghanaian cocoa farmer who said, if weather stays like this, there will be no cocoa to export next year. If Galamsey and illegal farming continued, there'd be no cocoa to export either. Weather volatility, especially El Nino, and long-term climate change is hurting yields. And you can see here a correlation between the rainfall anomalies and yield declines in the Ivory Coast. So the drought years see sharp drops in yield and more disease outbreaks. What's interesting though is that you have the dry weather, but 2 years ago in July, it was really record rainfall that hurt the Ivory Coast crop even more, with severe flooding, surprise rainfall after a long period of drought, and the water couldn't absorb, the soil couldn't absorb all the moisture, and it became problematic because you had the overcast days, lack of sunshine, and just too much rain, and that also helped to spread disease and have increased proliferation. So it's also not just a drying trend, but it's also the irregularities in the weather patterns. So the Ivory Coast is struggling to regain their lost output. So you could see where there was an expectation that the Ivory Coast crop would be up about 10% in the 24-25 season, which we're now in the tail end of. And when you measure Ivory Coast arrivals, or the volume of cocoa that's reaching the port, next slide. What you can see is that the arrival number started out really strong. Arrivals were up about 30% to begin with. And then week by week by week, the numbers declined. And then for the mid-crop, so the main crop is October to March, the mid-crop April to September, the numbers are down about 40%. And so the entire gain in the main crop was wiped out by the losses in the mid-crop. So that's what the dotted line is, the separation between the main crop and the mid-crop, and the comparison for the past 2 years. So here you could see it another way, the exact same data on a cumulative basis, and you could see how the crop started out to be ahead on the weekly arrivals, and then as the season wore on, we were falling further and further behind, and now we're slightly behind. We're 2% behind where we were a year ago with the Ivory Coast crop. So instead of seeing production increasing 10%, we're now down 2% with 7 weeks left to the season, and it's not expected to get any better. Here's Ghana's output. So Ghana's faring a little bit better, but not so much. So you had this tremendous crop that reached almost, it was over 1 million bags, or 1 million tons. See, I talk coffee, cocoa, tons, bags. So you have the Ghana's crop was over 1 million tons, and then just fell apart. Could not make a comeback. And so that became worrisome. So the focus was on Ghana being lost forever. Ghana's not coming back. But then you flip back to what happened in the Ivory Coast, and you're saying, okay, which of the two is more problematic? And it's like this toss-up. I mean, every week there's another story about which one is going to do worse than the other. So Ghana's crop this year, originally, the government was forecasting production to come back to 700,000. They'll finish up at 600,000, about 100,000 less than expected in terms of the recovery. Now look at Brazil. Brazil, as I said, in the 80s used to be the second largest producer, and witch's broom wiped out a good part of the crop. And Brazil struggled to have a comeback. Now Brazil is talking about making super farms, and that they're going to have huge farms, high productivity, and Brazil is going to become the super producer once again. Well, some of the problems of how they're trying to expand could be problematic, and it might not succeed as well as they thought. Okay, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute or so, but just think in terms of if you're cloning and you're using the same variety and you run into a problem, at what point do you have immunity and then you lose your production? And that's pretty much what happened in Indonesia. So I'm not 100% sold that Brazil is going to have the success story in cocoa production that they're hoping for. I think there's some problems there. Now, let's look at Ecuador. Okay, so we're bringing this one home. And the quote that I found from an Ecuador co-op manager is, "Quality and traceability are tickets to survive." I love that quote. Not all cocoa is created equal, and certified and premium beans now command premiums of up to 40% over bulk cocoa. There's push for certification programs like Fair Trade and Rainforest Alliance, and for some, it's becoming very important, and especially for accessing the European and US markets. Am I a fan of some of the certification programs? Not necessarily, okay? So a lot of the certification programs started in the early 2000s when prices were very, very depressed. And the thought was, what are we going to do to help the producers? Because the manufacturers recognized that if they didn't do something to pay producers more, that they will not have the cocoa or the coffee to survive. And so it's very easy to be a big sport and pay higher prices. Once prices started to come up, though, suddenly there's, well, why should we pay all this money for some of the certification programs? And there's been a backlash. And there's also been a lot of consumer confusion. If you ask the typical consumer, okay, why they're buying Fair Trade or Rainforest Alliance, they can't even begin to tell you what the program really stands for. So something was lost along the way, and I think that there's a lot more that can be done on a local and ground level within the country that doesn't put the burden, the paperwork and the dollar burden for some of the certification programs, that there's alternatives. Now, a case example that I use here also is that we have brands like Tony's Chocolonely that are building their business on 100% traceability. And this is where a few minutes ago where I said, well, consumers are giving pushback and they're making companies stand by their word. And this company that was pushing for 100% traceability, consumers called them out on it and said, we don't see it. And they hurt the brand image as a result. They said, you're not providing you're not sticking to your word and your pledge, and it became problematic. So that's where it needs to be really careful in terms of what you say versus what you do, and to make sure that the two match. And I think from listening to the speeches yesterday, I was really, really impressed with every single speaker and the enthusiasm in this room. And I think that it's contagious. And so I think everyone here needs to give themselves a big round of applause for that. And if you just follow the words from what was said, then Ecuador. So much great information has been given out in the past 2 days. And so Ecuador will continue to have a success story because of that, and not necessarily from the outside forces and programs. I think Ecuador is on the right track to continue. Now, some downsides. Okay, we have EUDR and tariffs, and that is redrawing trade flows. Okay, so Ecuador's success story. And next. Okay. So, redrawing the map here. So, a quote from the International Coffee Organization, it said the new EU rules will be the biggest trade disruptor in a generation. And I think that's 100% true. Okay, so the new EU deforest regulation is going to fundamentally change cocoa flow and coffee and palm, because you have to have your product fully traceable and deforestation free to enter the European Union as of the end of this year. Now, is the industry ready for that? And the answer is no. Is the EU ready to police it? No. Is there going to be a possible delay because there's no way that anyone is going to be ready for this in 4 months? I hope so. Okay? I can't speak, I'm American, I can't speak for the Europeans, okay? But I certainly hope so, because otherwise it is going to be a mess. And so looking at smallholders in West Africa, they aren't ready at all. 90% lack the necessary land documentation of GPS mapping. This could divert more trade to Asia and the Middle East. And therefore, Europe isn't going to be able to get the cocoa from the suppliers as they normally do. We're going to have problems as a result of this. Okay, I mean, I can't even begin to think in terms of how much trade has to be diverted and what is going to happen in terms of the European market. And then you complicate that with Trump tariffs, okay? And so it's like, okay, well, we can't take this cocoa at high prices into the US and high tariffs if they actually stick. So it'll go to the European market, but that cocoa we can't certify, we can't trace it, and then where does it go? Okay, and to me that's problematic, that there's going to be a lot of small farmers who are hurt by this, okay? And in terms of, I can't speak for the EU and their policy, but I can speak as a New Yorker, okay? And I think that the tariffs for coffee and cocoa are going to disappear, okay? That the US, the Commerce Secretary, has already said that products that we don't grow in the US will be allowed to come in duty-free. as before. The only problem that we have is that we have a president that has an ego, and he loves the art of a deal and negotiating. And if you can stick it to a number of countries, and Brazil is one of them, and India is another, okay, then he's going to hold out in making that official, okay? But it's going to happen. I mean, like 100%. I think that there's no way that the tariffs for coffee and cocoa are going to be implemented on a country-by-country basis, okay? And if it's not me that's thinking this, there's also the World Trade Organization, okay? Where you can't bring products in and have favoritism for one country over the other. Most favored status principle, okay? And so if there's agreements for some countries to bring in coffee and cocoa at 0 tariffs, you can't jeopardize another country and charge them a higher rate. Okay, so there's going to be like untold lawsuits and problems if it doesn't go away. It's very different when you're talking about widgets and, you know, manufactured products, okay? But when you're talking about a basic commodity that we don't grow in the United States, then the problems are enormous. And the industry is fighting it. The industry, the producing countries and associations are lobbying against it. US Congress is fighting against it. And then it's going to disappear, okay? So my answer is don't fret about it, okay? That it's disheartening that it's happening, but it is a problem that's going to go away. I cannot say the same thing about EUDR so fast. That one, less control on it. Okay, so now let's talk about processing and value addition, okay? So there's a growing push for processing in origin countries. And I know in terms of Ecuador, it's like, should we follow this route or not? Okay, and push more for selling butter and powder into the international market as an increased percentage of production. So in the Ivory Coast and Ghana, okay, there's been a lot of investment from major companies promoting local processing to capture more value. The Ivory Coast is now the world's largest processor. Okay, the Ivory Coast grinds more than any country in Europe and the US. That ran into a problem this year and last year because their production tanked, and the major buyers who were counting on the beans were also counting on the butter and the powder and couldn't get that supply. And in turn, that's what really triggered the higher prices in the market, was really the shortfall in the US and Europe of butter and powder. Because the reliance of the Ivory Coast in particular for such an enormous supply. And the capacity wasn't there in the US or the ability to buy the product from other countries. And therefore it created the shortfall. Sorry. Okay, so we're talking about origin processing and value addition here, okay? And this trend for processing more in a producing country is going to continue. And as I said, the biggest percentage of this is the Ivory Coast, where production is 1.8 to 2 million tons, and they're grinding 600 to 700,000 tons, and a new facility is opening up. We have exports of semi-processed cocoa up 40% in 2024, and Cargill had a $100 million cocoa processing facility in the Ivory Coast that they invested in. So that is where a lot of the money has been going for processing, and then buyers in turn, that's where they're taking their butter and their powder. But let's look at, not everything, as I said, is rosy on the side of the cocoa manufacturers with high prices and margins. Okay, so these are the margins, the percentage of earnings that the major companies receive for transforming your cocoa beans into chocolate and other products. And they have, Hershey has about a 15% margin, and Nestle and Mondelez, which used to be Kraft, have a slightly lower percentage. But you can see in the past 2 years how their percentage went down because of high prices. And when you look at it, you say, yeah, but they're still making, 12%. And it seems like a large number, but there's a lot of taxes and other things that need to be deducted out. And it's actually, they're operating on relatively thin margins for a company that is as large as they are. Okay, so what do they do when they have their profit margins under pressure and shareholders are banging at their door and saying this isn't tolerated? Okay, and your stock is going to go down. So they look at ways to shrink packaging, change ingredients, and cheapen their costs.